I became involved in civil liberties in 1971. At that time, a racially selected Springboks team came to Queensland to play football, and there had been much demonstrations against them in southern states. The then Premier, Joe Peterson, who was in the early stages of a very long period of being Premier in this state, believe it or not, declared a state of emergency to allow the football game to be played in Brisbane. There was a group then of law students from the university that were in effect legal monitors carrying on the tradition of legal observers that was started by the UK Council for Civil Liberties in London in the 1930s. So I joined that group of legal observers, and what I saw in terms of police violence and police brutality changed my view of the criminal law very significantly. At that time I was only a third year law student, so if I have anyone to thank for my career in civil liberties, it is the police and Sir Joe Peterson. I joined the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties in 1976. That's when I graduated as a lawyer. Derek Fielding was the then president of the council. He sent me to Cedar Bay, which is outside of Cooktown, to investigate claims that were circulating in the media that the police, after a drug raid, had burnt down the hippies' huts at a commune at Cedar Bay. What occurred was that there was a massive drug raid. Queensland Police, and believe it or not, Australian customs boats were used to supposedly find a large marijuana crop. All that they found were some hippies who were using marijuana for personal use. There was no crop found. The police burnt the huts of the hippies down after they had finished the raid. I was sent up there to take statements. That had its own humorous side in that I went up in my green safari suit, which my mother had given me for my admission, and I was driven to about a point of about a kilometre from Cedar Bay itself, and I had to walk along the beach to get to Cedar Bay. As I got closer to where the hippies were living, I saw this woman come towards me, and there's nothing remarkable in that except that she didn't have any clothes on, it being a hippie commune. So in deference to the nudity, having regard to my Celtic skin and Catholic background, I sat around my underpants for 3 days taking statements. Eventually, an inspector of police and another police officer were charged with arson, but they were acquitted by a Cairns jury.
Before QCCL, I have always been involved a little bit in Liberties, having my first little revolts in high school in Armidale in New South Wales, and then joining the Abortion Law Repeal Association in New South Wales. When John moved up to Brisbane as a professor at the university, I moved up too. So I was in good training almost to join the Children by Choice group to help women with unplanned pregnancies, and the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties, because I consider that to be a civil liberties issue, a prime civil liberties issue.
My involvement with civil liberties commenced as a 19-year-old when I was articled to Terry O'Gorman. If you're an articled clerk to Terry O'Gorman, your involvement in civil liberties is inevitable. I was thrust at an early age into the madness of short deadlines, media responses for Terry, and general support of someone I'd consider a true civil libertarian crusader. I quickly realised that I had so much to learn. Terry instilled in me that the police can't be trusted with more powers and that governments needed to be watched very closely. And I've been grateful to have learnt from the best, and he has certainly shaped my sense of social justice, civil liberties and human rights. And although my direct involvement with the council has been somewhat limited, I've enjoyed a really close personal and professional relationship with Terry, where we have sought to address human rights issues in different ways. And I feel that my work with the community legal sector has been a good complement to Terry's work with the Civil Liberties Council. Our organisations share very similar visions and missions, and we try and address similar underlying problems in society.
Well, I was part of that generation that got radicalised by the Vietnam War and through protest, and we reacted very strongly against the attempts by Premier Bjelke-Petersen to stop street marches because we had plenty to protest about, and the idea that in a free society that you could be prevented was just anathema. And so hundreds of people took to the streets to protest, indeed thousands of people over periods of time. That's kind of how I got involved with civil liberties initially. Then the council I got involved with in the late 70s through having been a social worker with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Legal Service, and I was asked to chair a committee on the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the council, and I did that, and the council spoke out against many of the inequalities and injustices that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people faced, and I got involved with the council initially in that way, but as part of a generational thing where we'd all grown up in a repressive, racist society that disapproved of the arts and didn't support free speech and freedom of creativity, and it was part of that kind of generation of trying to make a stand.
I think I joined the QCCL when I was in high school, because I joined a number of things when I was in high school, including Amnesty, and I think I joined Council for Civil Liberties. But I didn't really become very involved, I think probably 1989 or 1990, actually. The first meeting I ever came to was in fact in Stephen Kimes' chambers when he was the president, not in this room, but downstairs. So, so I was just a member who received newsletters for quite a while, and that was the first meeting I ever came to, was in Stephen's chambers. So that's how I became involved. So I've always been interested in civil liberties things, and eventually I summoned up the courage to turn up to one of their meetings.
Well, I was a student at UQ, like you, and I started doing medicine in 1971, which was the year of the Springbok tour, when there were lots of demonstrations, and then I started arts law in 1972. So I was aware of the council, I think, before I'd finished high school, and I was still aware of it. Derek Fielding and Terry O'Gorman were both visible in the media on behalf of the council, and I came from a sort of Catholic, Labour, social justice background, so I really wanted to be involved, and I thought it was a useful way of using my minuscule legal skills at that stage. So sometime in that period, 1972, 1973, 1974, I started going to meetings, and I certainly know by the time I started articles of clerkship in 76 that I was going to meetings because I was in town then and I had to go out there. So we used to meet probably in the library, because Derek was the university librarian. We met in some room, and Dr. Janet Irwin was on the council. So there was this this great dialogue between the criminal lawyers and the women members of the council as to whether a criminal trial was unfair to complainants in sexual cases. And I think the women eventually won that argument in terms of legislation, and we probably look back now and say, well, those changes are, as they've been carried out over the years, are probably fair to both complainants and defendants. But so that's the atmosphere in the 70s. I haven't talked about the political atmosphere at all, but I was a student, I was a law student, meetings were on campus, the council got a fair bit of publicity, so I was aware of it, and somehow or other I made contact and joined. Yeah, that was, I found it really interesting. It was very educational for me, and it was not so much that I used my legal skills to contribute, it was more actually I was able to gain confidence in reading statutes and interpreting sections and stuff like that, because you read a lot of draft legislation in terms of preparing submissions, etc. So I found that quite enjoyable and quite good.
I first joined QCCL in 1978 during the 1977-1979 street march ban. I was living in Toowoomba at the time, and beforehand I had participated in street marches in Sydney against the Vietnam War, but I hadn't made a connection between the right to street march and civil liberties. So that was the first time I made that connection in Toowoomba. The second thing is I had had some articles published on drug law reform and abortion law reform in a university student newspaper in the early 70s. And also I hadn't thought of those as civil liberties issues, interestingly enough. So I understood then that those were all civil liberties issues after that those protests started in 77. The street march ban was made law in September 1977, and that led to the first big illegal march, which was organised by the Campaign Against Nuclear Power in Brisbane on October the 22nd. Hundreds of people were arrested. And then the energy switched to the right to march. So a whole lot of energy went out from the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-uranium mining movement, and the whole focus became the right to march as a civil liberties issue. And civil liberties groups were organised in Brisbane and in Toowoomba, specifically to address the street march issue. And those groups were using the tactic of illegal marches and illegal protests of other kind to oppose the ban. The ban continued until 1979, and it ended when the Campaign Against Nuclear Power in Brisbane lodged an application for a street march permit for the first time in 2 years, and it was accepted. And the reason they lodged that application was a personal intervention by me, because at that time I was chair of both. I was the spokesperson of both the Toowoomba Civil Liberties Group and also the Toowoomba Campaign Against Nuclear Energy. After the street march ban was ended in late 79, a lot of the energy went out of that movement, and I went back to campaigns on drug law reform and abortion law reform. In the first instance, I successfully moved a motion at the 1981 State Labor Party conference to make Labor policy to decriminalise marijuana, and I moved the motion against the wishes of the minister, or the shadow minister I should say, at that time, and also the policy committee. But there was a lot of support amongst the members at that conference. And in terms of abortion law reform, I went back to writing letters to the local newspaper, and the editor at that time, Bruce Hinchliffe, had a policy of publishing all letters unless they were defamatory or really obnoxious. And so I organised and wrote about 100 letters advocating abortion law reform in the local newspaper in Toowoomba before I went to Brisbane in 1982. The local newspaper is the Chronicle. It's still there, still going today. So after I moved to Brisbane, I concentrated on my new job and career for the best part of the next 20 years or so. And then in the early 90s, I rejoined QCCL because the drug law reform issue and the abortion law reform issue weren't really going anywhere. And as a result of that, I made my first long submission on cannabis law reform to a committee that was formed by the Crime and Misconduct Condition, the CMC, at that time in 1993, in conjunction with a similar submission by Peter Applegarth, who was at that time a Vice President of QCCL. And then after that, I made, I've made about five different long submissions, generally speaking, to state and federal parliamentary committees advocating legalisation of cannabis.
Look, I don't think there's any signal outstanding individual achievement. I think the achievement of the council, it now being in its 50 years, is that it has lasted that period of time. Its achievement is that it has achieved so much with so few resources. And while generally the president of the day or the vice president does the media interviews, there are a lot of people behind the scenes that contribute significantly to the output and to the standing of the council. If there is one single achievement over the period of time that I've been involved, it is that over a period of time the council has achieved significant credibility in the media. The media regularly seek the council out for comment, and while there's no one single outstanding achievement, I think the fact that government of both colours in this state, Labor on the one hand and the LNP, are criticised by the Civil Liberties Council shows that we are an apolitical organisation, and I think it's important that that continue.
It's always, because of the nature of what we do, I think it's very difficult to point to anything that we can actually say we achieved. The most concrete thing that I know of that we were involved in was the creation of the Public Interest Monitor, which Terry did a lot of work with I'm going to mental blank, the then National Party Attorney General, who was Russell. Anyway, but I think we had a significant contribution, I think, in relation to the anti-discrimination legislation when Ian Dearden was the president. But beyond that, I mean, because we're an advocacy organisation, it's very difficult to point up and say, we built that. So, but yes, to my knowledge anyway, the most concrete thing you could point to that we did is involved in the creation of the Public Interest Monitor, which is now spread to other places. Victoria now has one, and it has some functions under Commonwealth legislation, mostly because of Peter Beattie insisting that it be there. So it's a concept that they're campaigning for in New South Wales now as well. So it's an idea which has gone past Queensland. And it's a useful thing because it allows for an opponent on applications for warrants, and it's been inserted in some of the anti-terrorism legislation now. That's where it's been moved into the Commonwealth sphere.
Yeah, well, it's a massively achieving organisation. One of the things that I thought was a major contribution at the time, and I can't really date this in terms of years, except I suppose it's after I started my articles of clerkship in 1976, so it might be 1978. There were riots at Boggaroo Jail. I mean, they weren't the only riots in prisons in Australia during that period of time, and we got massively organised, and we used a lot of people who weren't members of the council to do various matters. As an article clerk, I instructed council in a number of different trials, including I think Matt Foley, who'd come to the bar by then. He did one of the trials, but I was probably involved in 4 or 5 trials. John Gerard, who was on the Court of Appeal until a few years ago. He was counsel in one of those. I thought he was a fabulous advocate then, and he was. But yeah, that was a tremendous experience for me, and obviously it provided an access to justice for prisoners who probably would have just been, really had not much option but to plead guilty to the charges. So I really liked that. We also arranged legal observers at some of the big Right to March demonstrations, and during the SEQWEB in 1985, the SEQWEB lockout, there were lots and lots of pickets, and legal observers went to them. I think I got to give evidence out of one of those. I'm not sure that I helped the magistrate find one way or another, but you know, that was a fairly important thing as well. But probably the answer to your question is that at a time when one party dominated Parliament, the Council created a dialogue. The Council kept alive issues that were very hard for the Parliamentary Labor Party to make much headway with at the time. And that meant that ideas of what we talk about now as human rights were kept alive in people's minds, and that whatever the government decided to do, it knew it would have a fight if it went beyond across certain lines. And so I think we importantly contributed to the ideas and the dialogue of the time. So I think that was fairly important.
Look, undoubtedly the enactment both at state level and federal level of a Human Rights Act, the more you look at terrorism law in this country, the more you look at terrorism law in this country compared to the UK, Canada, who are jurisdictions closest in legal structure to ours, the more you see the importance of a Human Rights Act. There can be much debate about whether terrorism laws in this country have gone too far. I personally think they have, but at least in the UK and Canada, you can take terrorism laws to court. You can challenge them as being contrary to the Human Rights Act in both of those countries. But as the outstanding Professor George Williams from Sydney University has often said, the only challenge you can make to terrorism laws in this country is on the somewhat exotic, and that's my word, but on the somewhat exotic basis that it's contrary to the chapter in the Constitution that says you cannot fetter the judicial role.
I would say the continuing expansion of anti-terror laws is the most important issue, because it is slowly eating into other areas of the law. So things which are being implemented in anti-terror statutes are now being moved into other areas of the law. So we have in the bikie legislation these sort of preventative detention concepts. We have preventative detention legislation for what are called violent offenders. We had it in sex offender legislation before it went to anti-terrorism legislation, but now we're talking about detaining people after they've been released from prison. That's all out of anti-terror legislation. The use of secret evidence, which I think is one of the most pernicious aspects of anti-terror legislation, is now taking hold all over the place. And of course the bikie laws, particularly the Newman ones, were very much modelled on anti-terror stuff, and still the new ones that the Palaszczuk government brought in have some of those similar concepts in them. So from the point of view of overall civil liberties, I think the pernicious effect of anti-terror laws, not just their immediate effect, but their pernicious effect is the big threat that confronts us in terms of police powers.
But in Queensland particularly, still probably the biggest human rights for women is the old abortion law, the 1891 abortion law, because until women are trusted to manage their own bodies in law, they will never be trusted in the workplace or in Parliament or anywhere else, really trusted. I mean, because if you can't manage that, how could you manage those other things?
Australians are lucky to live in one of the most prosperous, developed and civilised societies in the world, but this can lead to complacency, and it allows governments to slowly erode our rights and liberties. Maintaining a vigilant and informed society is a really important challenge in order to protect civil liberties. Community education is a powerful tool, and one of the big challenges is to ensure that the community is educated so that we can combat sensationalism and we can ensure that the dangerous and slippery slope of rights erosion does not occur in our country.
I think the continuing great, profound failure of our society to respect the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. An Aboriginal child born today still has a far greater chance of being taken from his or her parents and put into state care. There's a far greater chance than the rest of the community of being incarcerated as a juvenile or as an adult in prison. So we just are failing to provide genuine equality before the law for such people. I think in terms of some of the other issues, that George Orwell hit the nail right on the head. Big Brother's watching, Big Brother's listening, Big Brother is keeping an eye on your metadata, Big Brother's reading what you might have to say, and where all that data winds up is anybody's guess. So every time some major social problem comes up, like terrorism or heinous offences against children, there's another wave of enthusiasm on the part of governments and police, law enforcement bodies to suck up this information. And there's a huge amount of data being gathered through social media, being used by private industry. Where all that winds up, how it's used, we've got very little idea and very little in the way of safeguards. So I suppose you could call it a right to privacy, but it's more than that. It's a right to a free society where you have some idea of the way in which information that we use in day-to-day life gets processed, analysed, stored and used, who knows when and who knows where. When you look back at and you read George Orwell's novel, you think, gee, Big Brother was only watching here and there, but now, watching you walk through the mall, you've got a dozen cameras on you, you've now got facial recognition. Who's got access to that? It's not just ASIO and the CIA, it's and not just police services, but presumably Google and lots of advertisers, and who knows who gets access to your social media. So that, I think, is a huge challenge that we face. And I think that reflects the fact that we've increasingly set up bureaucracies to try to regulate and deal with social problems. And we've probably made the mistake of giving these bureaucracies too much power, too much resources, too much in the way of coercive and intrusive powers. But at a sort of social, cultural, educational level, I say that I'm quite worried about the intolerance that's come into much of public life, including our universities. Instead of being respectful of free speech and of eccentricities, contrarians, and different point of view, there seems to be an intolerance, an unwillingness to allow people to speak out. I mean, the great way to combat evil ideas is to put them out there and to use evidence and argument to deal with them. And I fear there's, both on the right and the left, an intolerance which is deeply unfortunate. I grew up in a generation where we hated the fact that the Bjelke-Petersen government would crack down on anybody who expressed a different point of view, and so we were conditioned to respect the right of other people to disagree with us. But that seems to have gone out the window, and I do hope that particularly the education institutions and society would show a little more respect, because the idea of civil liberties, to be a free citizen in a free and open society, depends upon restraint, depends upon my freedom depends upon your willingness to tolerate and accept my free speech. So my rights are dependent upon your responsibilities to be open-minded. And I do fear that a darkness has crept into public debate.
I mean, for me, and this is probably not seen as a classic civil liberties issue, but it goes importantly to the right to life. I think whatever capital punishment exists in the world, we should do everything we can to bring it to an end. And that fundamental right to life is something that the state is not entitled, in my view, to take away. And so that's a really important issue for me. In the Australian context, the terrible things which the government has done with the consent and cognizance of both major party groupings to asylum seekers is a real issue that I think very many people feel very concerned about. The anti-terrorism legislation, which is passed at both state and federal levels, raises questions all the time, and the debate is now, I think, usefully framed in the language of human rights jurisprudence. So people talk about reasonableness and proportionality and the least restrictive way of achieving results. So I don't think any person talking about legislation to deal with a terrorist threat says, well, you just ignore the terrorist threat. But I think it's very, very important that whatever additional steps you take with regard to defining offences in that area and giving additional police powers in that area must be justified in accordance with that human rights jurisprudence. That is, the responses must be proportionate, they must be reasonable, they must be the least restrictive means of achieving those objects. So I think that's a really, really important area. And then what happens in the area of anti-terrorism just spills out into other areas of law. I mean, we now have decided as a society that it is all right to lock people up after their sentences have been imposed in the area of sexual offences. But that is still a very, very difficult subject. And I think the courts have been very good in ensuring that that legislation has been applied in the least restrictive way. But the challenges keep on coming because governments feel that they have to try to provide their citizens with security from everything. But in doing that, they take away rights of the whole community. And that debate is really, really important, that whatever steps are taken must be justified, they must be applied according to proper principles. We must respect the difference between writing the laws and enforcing the laws. Independence of the police force, independence of the courts are really important issues. So these sorts of issues never go away, and they'll keep on coming up in different guises as time.
My civil liberties friends will most likely say the surveillance society, but my reading of that is that most people don't care, actually. They happily give away loads of personal information just for the convenience of maps and directions and advertisements, and also very addictive apps like WhatsApp and so on. That make communication extremely easy and also now are protected. Personally, I think the most important issue is the war on drugs. It was in the war on drugs that the first big incursions of civil liberties into the general Western legal systems occurred. and specifically the reverse onus of proof and the shift from the criminal standard of proof to the civil standard of proof, the balance of probability standard of proof, all took place within the war on drugs, and then they were gradually moved into other areas of law. And so now, for example, Centrelink beneficiaries were recently attacked with a reverse onus of proof provision, which we can date back. We can thank the war on drugs for that particular provision. The other thing is that every day in Australia about 220 people are arrested for cannabis offences. Between 85 and 90% of those are for very small offences like cultivation, possession, use. So in my view, every day in Australia about 220 people have their civil liberties rights attacked directly and very publicly. And I think that's a real scandal. I think we really should be continuing to campaign on that issue.
We are well overdue for a Human Rights Act, and those in politics, whether it's on the right of the Labor Party or in the LNP, who say a Human Rights Act is a charter for criminals, just simply do not understand the purpose of a Human Rights Act. It is to keep a government accountable, and it is to have some judicial review of controversial laws, particularly in the ongoing enactment and the almost inevitable year by year ongoing enactment of more and more terrorism laws at both federal level and state level.
Well, I think the most important issue for Australia and for Queensland is that we should have a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act of some form over the whole country. We haven't got that, and that is, to me, very backward in relation to civil liberties in Australia. Some of the states have moved to introduce programs that give more rights than others. So civil liberties, I think, now needs to work for a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act for Australia.
Legislative change is just a small part of a society's respect for civil liberties and the protection of human rights. But in my view, a Human Rights Act is a great opportunity to create a more respectful relationship between our community and our government. It is a building block upon which civil liberties can be protected and rights can also be protected. A Human Rights Act will ensure that Parliament, who make new laws, account for how those laws will affect our civil liberties and our human rights. But a Human Rights Act will also require public authorities to comply with those human rights laws and respect the dignity of the members of the community. And finally, it will require courts to interpret laws in a way consistent with human rights. So in my view, that would be the simplest and quickest thing for our government to do in order to promote a culture of human rights in our community.
Well, two things. I think that Australian governments at the state and national level should introduce a Bill of Rights. Governments have been talking about this for a long time. Victoria's introduced it. It's been introduced in the ACT. The Palaszczuk government in Queensland has promised to introduce it. That's what it would. I would hope that the federal government would do so. And that, I think, would help bring Australia back more into line with other democracies throughout the world where there is a Bill of Rights and where it forms part and parcel of the inherited framework of our society. I think the other thing governments could do is to do less. The huge volume of legislation that's introduced, each time introducing a new set of do's and don'ts, means that we're a very regulated society. It'd be good for every time we introduce a whole new set of do's and don'ts in legislation and regulation that we knocked off a corresponding number. I remember many years ago, Dame Roma Mitchell in the Boyer lectures talked of the web of the criminal law and the way in which statutes were being used to create social outcomes by way of regulation in a manner that really wasn't intended to be used in the criminal law. And many of those statutes have relatively minor penalties, but they produce a record, and that record stalks a person for the rest of their lives. And with data being shared the way it is, it stalks them not only here in Queensland but throughout Australia, overseas, when they apply for an American passport and so on. So I think, I had the honour to be part of two great reforming governments under Wayne Goss and Peter Beattie, and we set up a whole lot of commissions to reform things, to try to make them better. In retrospect, I just wonder whether we made the mistake of introducing too much bureaucracy. There is a sociology of bureaucracy. Who says organisation says bureaucracy, I think the sociologist Michel said. And we should be wary of it. As civil libertarians, we stand for the freedom of the individual, the freedom to speak out, the freedom to pursue beauty, truth, or whatever. The freedom to go to hell in your own handbasket. So we should be sceptical about the setting up of further government institutions.
The thing that we need is a Human Rights Act, both at the state level and the national level. The problem that's one of the ways that you would have a restraint on the anti-terror laws. If you had a Human Rights Act, that would be reviewed against it, and so that would act as a restraint on some of the anti-terror laws. We even already see that in the ACT, where the ACT government got some relaxation of the laws that it had to bring in at the most recent COAG debacle, and that was all on the basis of their Human Rights Act. So it would act as a restraint. What else we can do about anti-terror laws? Well, that is about the only thing that we can do about them. I think we just continue to campaign. I've just finished putting together a joint submission in relation to the round from July or whenever it was. And of course there would be submissions in relation to the most recent ones a couple of weeks ago. So that's the problem with it. Every time something happens, a new round of legislation comes out, and then you get people like Daniel Andrews, who in many respects is on the progressive side, comes out and tells us that civil liberties are a luxury. That's an extremely alarming development. So that's why we need a Human Rights Act. A National Human Rights Act, I think, is on the agenda, and we were hoping we'd get one in Queensland and would push it along. We might still get one in Queensland.
Now we've got another.
Well, I think the two issues that I touched on before, in fact, there's already been, Australia's just been reviewed by the committee which administers or implements the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So there's been a formal process. Non-government entities have made submissions, the Human Rights Commission have made submissions, the Australian government's made submissions. There's been a hearing in New York, I think, which both government representatives and others have been questioned about these matters. And the reports that we've seen have been comments, I think, made in that hearing process that with regard to asylum seekers and with regard to some anti-terrorism issues, the Australian government, and with regard to some anti-discrimination issues as well, the Australian government, or Australia as a country, opts out. It sort of tends to regard the ICCPR as optional. We can do things better, we know best, whereas we have that process there by which there is a judicial process by a highly respected committee which makes judgments on complaints. And I'm told that the final observations of that committee will be handed down early on Saturday, our time, so it's, whether it's New York or Geneva or wherever, it's on Friday afternoon in the place where it's happening. And so they will provide very interesting reading with regard to Particularly, I mean, the asylum seekers issue, it is just mind-boggling if people could step back and see what we have done to the world's most vulnerable people it really goes back to about 1992, 1993 that we decided that compulsory detention, mandatory detention, or universal detention perhaps, was to be our policy. So that's 25 years now, and obviously offshore processing, the situation in Manus Island, the situation in Nauru, they're all just terrible circumstances, the deaths that have occurred of people on Nauru. It's very, very troubling, and I think a lot will be made of that when the committee hands down its report. So they're two of the big issues, the response to terrorism and the asylum seeker issue. But if I can just say something about the response to terrorism, it is a great cover-all phrase, so that whatever we do here and whatever we say about terrorism, you know that the same formulation and the same language will be used by other countries around the world to impose very, very oppressive measures, often against their peaceful political opponents. So we must be very, very careful that we don't give comfort to the world's dictators by the sorts of language we use and the sort of actions we take as well with regard to vulnerable people.
Wonderful. Just have another check. Right, let's scoot real quick. Yeah, we have enough time for the last question.
Okay, good.
Bit of a lighter one. Would you like to wish the QCCL a very happy 50th birthday?
Well,
you can talk at length.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing. I mean, that 50 years. It's not getting to the end of 50 years. That's such an amazing achievement, but it is, because that's involved different leadership at different periods of time. It's involved different foot soldiers at different periods of time. The people who founded it. Operated in a very difficult field before I got involved, and Terry's and Matt's contributions are amazing, and Derek, who I've already mentioned. But there's a different set of foot soldiers during all of those periods, and I after I stopped being president, I went on to something else, and so I haven't been active in recent years, although I remain a member. But there has been new leadership that has come on as other people went and did other things. I think Terry's never gone away, but so it is an amazing achievement. But what I would like, I'd like the QCCL to become an Australian equivalent of the ACLU. Perhaps it's a thing that should be done in association with other state councils and committees. And we have seen that with climate change litigation, that some of the community legal centres and some of the conservation groups have been able to access some funding from people who have money and who think that that's an important issue. But I think the QCCL should aim to raise a couple of $1 million and fund any kind of human rights and civil liberties litigation. And there's a real gap there, I think. You have bodies like the Human Rights Law Centre in Victoria, which funds a lot of the issues that, like asylum seeker issues, that go directly to the international conventions on human rights. But there's a lot of just, police powers issues, misuse of police powers, police acting badly, the sorts of things that Terry really pioneered the campaign against. Those things are still happening. You still see people being wrongly arrested, or people being assaulted when they're arrested. There was a major advance when when interviews in police stations were recorded and video recorded and stuff like that. But there are still issues out there, and I think it would be great if the Queensland Council could conduct 20 or 30 pieces of important strategic litigation every year. I think it would influence public opinion. I think it would influence police conduct and conduct of other agencies as well. And I think it would protect people's rights. So that's my dream for the QCCL. It's a bit unfortunate that I'm not there sitting in the committee meetings saying this is what we should do, but I certainly think that would be a wonderful present by QCCL to itself to embark on a major program to raise that, perhaps not the amounts that I've mentioned, but to raise an amount of money that would allow QCCL to conduct strategic litigation in the field of civil rights.
Two things. Ending the war on drugs, and the first step would be complete legalisation of cannabis, all users of cannabis, including medicinal users, but also recreational users. And the second thing, I think a Bill of Rights modelled on the Victorian model.
As a person who's been involved in civil liberties for many years, particularly in the council since 1976, I'm very proud to be around at the 50th anniversary of the QCCL. There are many people who have contributed to the success of the council, not only those who have the public face, the president, the vice president, but many people who do work behind the scenes. While I obviously will not be around for its 100th anniversary, I'm confident that the Queensland Civil Liberties Council is going from strength to strength, and it will remain the bane of both parties in the Queensland Parliament and in the Federal Parliament. If the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties can be an organisation that gets under the skin of both parties, we are doing our job.
That's right. Well, it's been enormously satisfying for me to belong to the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties and be involved in the right to march, to choose, and waving flags around. And we have not got as far as we should have in Queensland, but I think that Queensland Council of Civil Liberties has been one of the staunchest and the most consistent groups in Queensland. They are always there to comment on issues that are important to community, and they are asked to do it. I think people like Terry O'Gorman have done an enormously good job in relation to media contact. I hope you're not needed as much forever, but stay there.
Very good.
Yes.
Wow, 50 is a pretty big number. Well done, QCCL, and happy birthday. I wish to acknowledge the many champions that have contributed to your amazing work over the past 50 years, and I trust that others can build on those great achievements and continue the great work of the Council.
Happy birthday, Queensland Council for Civil Liberties. I look forward to it. I look forward in particular to seeing Terry O'Gorman there with a big shock of red hair and that green safari suit. Go, Terry!
Yes, happy birthday, Queensland Council for Civil Liberties. 50 years are young. Many more years to come, hopefully, because, the reality is that the need for the Council of Civil Liberties is never, ever going to disappear. It's a continuing work in progress.
Happy birthday, QCCL, and salutations to all the people who have made it happen and all the people who continue to make it happen.